Now here in the subsection 15.4, we're going to pick up with our monetary policy again. Now let's take a look at something called the equation of exchange. This is a very important formula that monetarists are particularly fond of because it describes a really interesting relationship between both the money supply and the final economy. The equation of exchange is listed right here as M times V equals P times Q. Now, what do these letters stand for? Well, the M is the easy one. That's money supply. That would be what the total amount of money that's been printed up by the Federal Reserve System, plus all of the lending done by banks that increase the money supply. And we measure it with either M1 or M2. M2 is usually the more popular version of the money supply definitions. So think of M as M2. Now we're going to multiply that by V, and V stands for velocity. Velocity is the average number of times money changes hands. So think of it this way, or rather as your author puts it, in the amount of circulation of money. Picture in your mind an individual dollar bill. You go to a Coke machine, you put the dollar bill in, you get the Coke. 5 days later, the sales rep who does the route rep comes by, empties out the Coke machine and takes the dollars out and deposits in Coca-Cola's account. Coca-Cola then, within 2 days, spends it on a salary for one of the workers. So you put $1 into the machine, and then 2 weeks later, that dollar is being spent again by the Coca-Cola company. It ends up in the paycheck of somebody. It sits in their checking account for 15 days, and then at that point, it's spent at Costco to buy groceries, and then on and on. The point I want you all to recognize is, I hope you all realize that one printed dollar bill does more than purchase $1 worth of stuff in a year. That $1 bill may actually get spent, 25 times in a year, once every other week. And so it might actually do $25 worth of business in the course of being spent. Now, of course, individual dollar bills get turned over relatively quickly. $100 bills turn over less frequently. And then, of course, the money sitting in your savings account, which was our definition of M2, some of that money may be sitting in there for years without being spent. So it turns out the average velocity is much smaller than 25. It's closer to around 5. So the point I want you all to recognize is, if you look at the first half of the formula, M times V, that will be the financial side of the economy. That is the total money supply times the number of times it is spent, tells you the total purchasing power of our society. Now, the total purchasing power of our society has to equal the total size of the economy. And P times Q measures the total size of the economy. The Q is the output, the quantity of output, so that would be actually measured numbers of cars, numbers of 2x4s, numbers of dozens of eggs, numbers of gallons of gasoline. So Q is a quantity of items produced. And P is a list of all the prices that were charged, the price for gasoline, the price for 2x4s, the price for eggs, the price for cars, and all the other things that you can buy are listed in the P. Think of it as the price level, because remember when we did the CPI is measuring the average price of all items. So think of P as this is the price level, so that's the average price times the total number of things made gives you the total nominal GDP. Now, as we've just pointed out, that makes it the same. Let's go ahead and go through this slide quickly together, but we've already kind of covered a lot of the important points of this. The P times Q will be the same as nominal GDP, because remember, that's how we calculated nominal GDP. We took whatever the quantity of the items were, multiplied by their prices, add them all up, and you get to the total nominal GDP. So the monetarist view is, if the M increases, as you see in this formula, and you can do the math in your head, if this number increases, in order for this equal sign to be true, something has to change. Either the V has to fall for the rising M, or the P times Q has to rise in order for that equal sign to be true. And so if this formula is correct, then we're going to find out there's going to be a connection between the M, which is under the money supply, which is under the control of the Federal Reserve System, and the rest of the economy. Now, economists assume that V, or the velocity of turnover of money, is stable. Not that it can't change, but that it does not change in the short run. And why is that? And that's because V is a function of how people handle their money and the institutions they use to do so. For instance, I get paid once a month. I imagine many of you all do too. If you get paid once a month, and let's just make up a number, let's assume that your paycheck is $2,000. The $2,000 comes into your account, and you have to be able to make payments for the entire month. You'll have to make a car payment, have to make a house payment, have to buy groceries, have to go out to dinner, on a date, whatever. All those things have to take place throughout the entire month. So you have to, all your money comes in, and you have to space it out over the month. So the number of times you spend $1 will be determined by a combination of how much money you have and the technology you have available to you to spend the money. Now, picture yourself, instead of getting paid once a month, what if you're a farmer and you get paid once a year? Think about it. That's all farmers get paid. If you're a wheat farmer and you plant in the spring and you reap in the fall, how often do you get paid? Well, in the fall, you go out and harvest all your crops, and you might sell it for $200,000. It's not like, you don't get a monthly check. You have to wait till the crops come in. So if you are a farmer, how careful do you have to be about how often you spend your money? Well, you have to realize whatever money comes in the fall has to last for the entire year. So the money that a farmer receives turns over very infrequently, right? Because he stretches out his payments all over an entire 12-month period. But if you're getting your check every month, you're only spacing it out over a month. So if you get paid monthly, velocity will be faster than if you get paid once a year. My point I just want you all to realize is the structure of the economy determines how rapid the V, or the velocity, is. In a farming society, velocity is very, very slow. In a society where people got paid literally every day, the velocity may be incredibly high because people just simply get paid today and spend it today. So money doesn't sit in an account for very long, it gets spent almost instantly. So every society, depending on its technology, where people work, what kind of industry they're in, will determine how rapid velocity is. And as you could imagine, that can't change very rapidly. I mean, you can change a society from being 90% farmers to being 90% industrial workers, but you can't do that in 1 year. It took the United States 100 years for that to happen. So you could see that velocity is going to be changing very, very slowly. So in our formula of m times v, if this v number is going to stay roughly the same for quite a long time, then if m changes, then what's the only thing left in the formula to change? It has to be either p or q. So let's go ahead and take a look at this issue. If the total spending, the P times Q, is going to increase when the money supply grows, then the Fed, or the Federal Reserve, should focus on the money supply, not interest rates, as we talked about as a potential lever, quote unquote, policy lever of what should the government pay attention to. Monetarists argue they should be paying attention to the size of the money supply and how fast it's growing. In other words, the Federal Reserve should not be manipulating interest rates. They should be focusing on the size and growth of the money supply. Now, let's take a look at another issue that we're going to work all these concepts. By the time we get to the end of these set of slides, we'll be able to start putting a bunch of ideas together. So right now, we're going to take a side deviation into something called the natural rate of unemployment. Monetarists also believe that in the short run, the Q of that m times v equals p times q. In other words, the Q is the quantity of actual goods produced, is relatively stable. It's a function of productive capacity, labor efficiency, and other structural forces. In other words, an economy of $20 trillion like the United States can't just simply produce next month up to 25 trillion and then the month after that fall to 15 trillion. I mean, we have way too many large factories for that to happen because most factories are operating at close to capacity. So you can't just simply artificially change the quantity very rapidly. It's like trying to maneuver a battleship on the ocean. I mean, it will turn, but it's not going to turn in any short run period of time, right? It's going to take a long time to turn a battleship. So if the Q is stable, then this leads to something called the natural rate of unemployment. Now, the natural rate, you see it's in quote marks, it's natural in one sense of the word. It's the rate of unemployment that will naturally occur in a well-functioning economy based on its productive capacity, its labor efficiency, and other structural issues. And it's fairly immune to short-run policy intervention, meaning you can't change the unemployment rate very easily by simply manipulating the money supply or other policy levers that the Federal Reserve or the rest of the federal government has at its disposal. Let me give you an example of what determines the natural rate, because I'm going to give you two different countries that will have two different natural rates of unemployment. Picture in your mind a country for which if you become unemployed, there is literally zero unemployment insurance. How rapidly do you think people will go find a job? Well, they're going to be under tremendous pressure to find a job, right? And so you could expect that the unemployment level will be relatively low because people will look for a job very diligently. Picture another society that says, we will let you be unemployed and pay you using unemployment compensation. We will pay you 100% of your salary, and all you have to do is tell us you're looking for a job, and we'll just take your word for it. And you can do this for 2 years. How long do you think it would take someone to find a job under that set of rules? Well, I think you recognize immediately with this new structure, so to speak, of the economy, people will just simply take a long time to find a job. Even if they're diligent people and not, scammers, the pressure would be off. And so, I'm kind of picky. If I don't find exactly the right job, I'm not going to take it. I've got 2 years to go look for it. I'm getting my full salary anyway, so I'll take a long time to find a job. The point I want you all to recognize is that you can change the natural rate of unemployment. So societies with little to no unemployment insurance will have relatively shorter spells of unemployment, whereas societies with very, very liberal unemployment insurance systems will have a large amount of unemployment. So those things are not changeable by changing the money supply or any other policy variable. People are not going to go back to work if they can get 2 years of free unemployment insurance just because interest rates are low. So that's the point that monetarists want people to recognize. Unemployment in the short run is relatively immune to policy interventions. So that means the only thing that really changes the long run rate of unemployment would be changing, for instance, the rules on unemployment insurance. That would cause unemployment to change, and other structural issues as well. A very heavily unionized society will tend to have a higher rate of unemployment because labor unions they don't expand and contract very easily with the number of workers. They're more rigid, they're more bureaucratized. So the more bureaucratized your labor force is, the less likely people will find a job quickly. It'll take them more time to do so. So anyway, those are all structural factors as opposed to factors influenceable by changing the interest rates. So let's take a look at the monetarist view now on a picture or a graph. So now we're going to assume that both V and Q are stable, meaning the V, the velocity, the number of times money changes hands, is relatively stable based on whether you're a farmer or a worker gets paid weekly or monthly. And the Q, meaning the output of goods and services, are relatively stable. Then if M increases, in the long run, what's the only thing that else can change in that formula of M times V equals P times Q? The only thing that can change is P, and that's what what our slide is telling us. Let's take a look at the graph to see what that means. In this graph, you see that long run supply is vertical. Remember, vertical means perfectly inelastic. Perfectly inelastic just means that whatever's on this axis does not seem to have any effect on whatever's on this axis. The Q stays the same even if P changes from P1 to P2. So obviously P has no impact on Q in this particular graph. I'm not saying that's true. I'm just saying in the way this graph was drawn, that's what your author is saying. So your author is saying this is what monetarists believe, that the long run supply, aggregate supply, is relatively vertical. Now, you notice that with our demand curves, we see that demand can change from aggregate demand curve 1 to aggregate demand curve 2. How did that happen? Well, the Federal Reserve printed more money. So with our formula of M times V equals P times Q, with more money times V means the total spending in the economy, or the aggregate demand, has risen, but there's no increase in output because the output can't increase in the short run. The output increases are determined by things like technology, the number of new inventions, the quality of our engineering, things like that will determine how many items can be produced, not whatever the amount of printed money. So what does go up? Well, as you can see, the price level went from P1 to P2, but quantity stayed the same. This is what monetarists believe. Increasing the money supply only raises the price level, or inflation. It does not affect the total output. So, well, I'll just now put it up on the screen in words, pretty much what I just said. So, any increase in aggregate demand increases the price level, does not increase the total output of goods and services. So, monetarists and Keynesians have very different schools of thought on these issues. For fighting inflation, when there's an inflationary gap, which is just a fancy word for saying when there is when the economy is growing faster than the long-run ability of the economy to produce goods and services, that means the economy is overheating. That's another analogy, of course. The economy is overheating, and if more people are trying to buy more goods and services than the economy is capable of producing, then there's going to be what? Price increases, triggering inflation. So an inflationary gap means the economy is overheating and prices are rising. So monetarists believe that the only way to handle this problem is to decrease the money supply, and the decrease in the money supply, of course, is going to trigger a shortage in money, raising interest rates, and you notice this is not correct. The slide should be, it will raise interest rates, and of course with a rise in interest rates, it will slow the economy down to something that the economy can handle. So the real interest rate, which we defined earlier in lectures several chapters ago, is the nominal rate minus the anticipated inflation rate. So if we can get the price level to fall, it could actually be that nominal interest rates can fall as well. Because if the anticipated inflation decreases, then businesses like banks would be willing to charge a lower nominal rate, not out of charity, but because they know with much, much lower inflation, even with a low nominal rate, they'll still earn a respectable real rate of return. So it could actually be true that as long as people's belief about inflation comes down, then a decrease in money supply actually could lower interest rates. The exact opposite of what you would expect to happen. But that's only if people believe the Federal Reserve will stick to its guns and actually throttle the inflation rate down by restricting the money supply. So a lot of this really does come down to how much do people believe the Federal Reserve will stick to its plan of reducing inflation. So in order to close the inflationary gap using monetary policy, or saying in more ordinary English, to reduce the inflation using monetary policy, we reduce the money supply and shift the aggregate demand curve to the left. So remember on the previous slide, increasing the money supply shifted the aggregate demand curve up and to the right. Now we're going to try to shift it down and to the left to reduce the price level to keep it from rising. So what monetarists want to have happen, or what they advise the Federal Reserve to do, is to maintain a steady and predictable change in the money supply and change it by roughly the amount that the economy naturally grows at in real terms, how much the real economy is growing. So if the real economy grows at 3% per year, increase the money supply by 3% per year, and then there will be no inflation because the money will increase at the same rate that the Q increases, and then the two offset each other at the existing price level. So this reduces uncertainty and stabilizes both long-term interest rates and GDP growth. That's the monetarist view of the best way to handle the economy. And then what do you do to fight unemployment? Fighting unemployment, the policy goal would normally be to increase aggregate demand. That's certainly the Keynesian point of view, that if we increase the aggregate demand or increase the money supply, that's how we're going to increase the aggregate demand. It will lead to higher prices, but inflationary expectations will also rise, and long-term interest rates may actually rise, defeating the purpose of the monetary stimulus. That's what monetarists worry about. They believe that the danger of trying to stimulate the economy is you may actually stimulate people's inflationary expectations faster than you stimulate the economy, and therefore you can have a real problem on your hands. Because if people's inflation expectations rise, what has to happen to nominal interest rates if people expect to get a real rate of return on loans? Then the nominal rate has to increase even faster, which could actually damage the economy. So, monetarists conclude that expansionary monetary policy can't lead us out of a recession because of the impact it has on inflation expectations, and therefore raises the interest rates rather than lowering the interest rates. So what they want to have happen is have the Federal Reserve get out of the business of trying to manipulate the economy on short run, either recessions or recessions, but instead to focus on long run stability, maintaining a stable increase in the money supply at a slow, predictable rate that will pretty much match the natural increase in the economy itself, and therefore essentially avoid making disturbing mistakes. They don't see the Federal Reserve as an agency that will solve problems. They're more worried about the agency actually causing problems. So what they're asking the agency to do is don't try to manipulate the economy, just try to run a nice, smooth, even course so that the natural economy just takes care of itself. That's the monetarist view, which of course is not the Keynesian view, but at this point we're focusing on the monetarist view.